Thank you for joining us for this replay of our recent webinar featuring Bill Sullivan, the American Transportation Association's EVP for Advocacy. Bill talks through the legislative challenges facing the transportation industry, as well as how the Biden administration and the current legislative branches intend to address. We hope you find his comments and insights helpful, and should you have any questions or comments afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me directly via the contact numbers listed at the end of the webinar. Enjoy.
And I have, what kind of crazy world does a kid from Knoxville, Tennessee grow up and talk to, senators, cabinet secretaries, and others? You all do real work. So our friends at USA Trucks and all of those you serve do the real stuff. We just do talking and meetings and telling a story. I never thought I'd do such a thing. And Chris Beer, a very close friend of mine, as he was being recruited to come into ATA, had a conversation with me about what if we could do it right? What if we could relentlessly listen and follow what this incredibly noble and vital part of the American economy and way of life. And I say this like a Pollyanna, but it's absolutely true. What might we be able to do? And man, I've had a blast for 5 years. James and the team at USA Trucks, as James came in and as people moved up and new people came in, what a joy to get to work with them. So taking time away from your day job, being willing to lead efforts on diversity and inclusion or talk about safety is the only way that we're able to make this thing work. And it starts with listening. So I really do hope people want to ask questions. No questions off limits. As Mark mentioned, and Tim too, I'm glad to follow up on any questions where I may not be the technical expert. But I'm just thrilled to be here today. And what I'm talking about with you are things that are part of our conversation every single day and hopefully are meaningful as you all try to see what the future in the real world looks like and how changes in government and goals and priorities in government line up with you. So let me just start with a quick look at the past. The Biden era, we are at a really busy and interesting time. I would say unique, but having worked here for 20 years, this stuff changes every year, every 6 months, sometimes every couple of weeks. But we came through an election that was fascinating. We had worked with President Trump and with a Republican Senate and with a Democratic House pretty successfully in advancing policies that were long held priorities of the members of ATA in terms of safety, in terms of simplifying some of the regs, the regulatory gears for the Trump administration were vastly different than those before it. And we were able to tell a story on safety policies, DOT policies, fights against some of our trial lawyer friends, and a pretty consistent story on what we need in terms of standards, environmental, energy, emission standards with a Trump EPA. And we felt great about being able to make progress and cross the finish line on a few of these. But then we come into the election and it was really surprising. Part of why it was surprising was not just the outcome, it was how close it was again. I live in the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C., and there are not many conservatives where we sit. So, if you listen to my neighbors, Biden was going to win every state and run away with the thing. And in fact, it was just about as close as it had been before. Donald Trump won basically 77-ish thousand votes in 4 states because of the Electoral College and the unique mechanics that our founding fathers put in place. Joe Biden won 3 states by something in the order of 30,000 votes. So the finish line doesn't tell as much of a story about how close the election was. And to all of the really partisan fights about the election and about the pandemic and mail-in voting, I'm glad to answer questions about that for anybody who wants to. We have a set of rules. The rules are followed and pretty understandable in a pandemic. And at the end of this process, you saw more Republicans in Congress. You saw, in many cases where they were projected not to win, you saw Democrats not swamp the Senate with a majority that was enough for them to actually achieve things simply in the Senate. And you saw state legislatures go even more Republican and some of them flip. So the strange outcome to me is while Donald Trump lost, Republicans won in other places that they weren't expected to. And so polling again was an issue. And this matters to us going forward because the outcome of this election helps determine where the next election's going and what political decisions members of Congress and the president make. And that's a fascinating thing. So the margins are really thin. The House is single digit margins. I forget if it's 6 or 8 for the majority for Nancy Pelosi to get 218 votes, or it's slightly under that now because of retirements and deaths. But it's really, really close, and the Senate is tied. So you have these really thin margins, and to someone who's, common sense driven, like I hope I strive to be, you would say, gosh, the margins are really close. People should be finding common ground. People should be agreeing on the things that are easy to agree on. But bizarrely enough, because this is Washington, D.C., that's not what's happening. What's in fact happening is even more partisan. The differences are so small that people fight even more about it. So pretty interesting. You all, everybody on this call and everybody in the United States and everybody across the world has had this tremendous generational challenge, unlike anything in my lifetime with COVID-19. And that's the personal side, the health side, the tragedy of this pandemic, and it also is the economy. And so some of the challenges that policymakers are trying to rise to are not only to keep people safe, not only to shore up parts of our country and civic life that need shoring up, and they may have different answers for how to do that, but also how to bring the economy to a healthy and stable place with as much employment as we can see and as good service in the economy to bring our lives closer to back to whatever the new normal is. So COVID-19 looms all the time. I would argue that this is a very transitional time. The speech or the panel that is 2 people, so I struggle to call it a panel, but the conversation that I hosted in our mid-year meetings in Texas included one of the grand old men of Democratic politics up here, connected to a whole bunch of different things, including Joe Biden, but a really wonderful guy named David Castagnetti. And we talked about this, and he had predicted at a truck pack, our political group in a couple years ago, had said his prediction for the Democratic primary was, with all the energy being young people and not only white people, that that the Democratic primary would have no chance. Well, not no chance, but he said, I predict that Democratic primary will not be a Caucasian who is older than 70 years old. Yet at the end of the thing, it was Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. 3 older Caucasians. So a really interesting time that I feel, and bet that most of you do. We're on the cusp of millennials, and I have a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old, but we're on the cusp of change. And I don't think anybody knows exactly what that will be. So let me give you sort of the big picture on this and a little bit of detail. But we see opportunities, challenges. We see really surprising optimism in a few areas that are big priorities to the trucking industry and to the country. We see some headwinds, and then we see some pretty serious challenges that we're going to be playing hard defense on. So we are really optimistic that a closely divided Congress, some of what we've seen and learned during the pandemic, point toward some ability, and also control by the Democrats of all 3, narrow control of all 3 major actors in town of House, Senate, and the White House. We see an opportunity for infrastructure, and I'll talk a little bit more about infrastructure, but there is the boring baseline, keeping the highway programs and the funding reauthorized, but then there's this other part that is infrastructure proposal and the rainbows and unicorns version, regardless of which party you're in. We also have been fighting with, and by we here, I really mean many of our state executives have been seeing the tide come in and wash over them in the states in terms of some of the environmental and emissions and energy rules and requirements, California being foremost among them, but also regional efforts, talking about carbon taxes, talking about other things. And some of the problem we have as interstate commerce is how the states treat this versus being able to operate in all 50 states. So we see a Biden administration as one that can grow the role that the federal government plays. And looking back, it was when my first day on the job, August of 2016, Chris Spear, our president and CEO, came running down the hall at our headquarters office, grabbed me, said, "We've got a call with EPA in the White House right now." Literally my first day on the job at like 6 o'clock in the evening. And it was EPA calling to say the hard work that ATA and a number of our members, OEMs, engine manufacturers, fleets had done on the phase 2 greenhouse gas heavy duty rule was now going final. And that and it was a 10-year implementation timeline, and it was achievable, and it was something that the ATA members supported. So so that's kind of the backdrop, that the EPA tends to move forward, tends to be greener on environmental policies than some of the people I grew up with, for sure. But it also tends to be more reasonable in the achievability and the timelines and the incentives for business and the costs that business incurs. So and to that end, Chris and I met with the head of EPA, the new head of EPA, Michael Regan, former head of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, yesterday. So we are bullish. We are optimistic that there will be a stronger federal presence that can counteract or supplant some of the work done in the states. Taxes is going to be something that the Democrats have partisan tools, this weird congressional thing called budget reconciliation, that they don't need Republicans to agree with them whatsoever, and they can just pass them. And Joe Biden's proposals have done that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, for those of you who may have been at our mid-year meeting, our Vice President of Labor and Workforce Issues, who also works with James Reed a lot, Nick Giel, former Chief of Staff at Department of Labor and used to work on the Hill, and is crazy sharp of a labor lawyers I've met. We have some headwind on labor issues. We will be playing defense on labor issues. The role that unions are playing in terms of organizing, the fights about independent contractor classification and misclassification. You'll hear more about that in a minute. So next slide, please. So just on infrastructure, to try to frame it and draw some good questions, first and foremost, to us geeks in Washington, D.C., there is nominally a 5-year authorization of surface transportation, commonly known as the highway bill. That bill, the last one, was called the FAST Act, was passed or was signed into law in December of 2015. The FAST Act expires. It expired last year, but it expires after an extension again September 30th of this year. So the relevant committees in Congress are working to reauthorize the FAST Act. The FAST Act was effectively $60 billion a year of highway funding. It didn't make any significant changes to how the revenue comes into it. We have supported very thoughtfully and mindfully a fuel tax increase, an increase in the federal user fee on fuel, gasoline and diesel. So a fair and equitable, not just trucking, but all road users who use the gas tax. We also have supported electric vehicle registration fees and other things to ensure everybody pays. But our suggestion, proposal, and Chris Spear testified alongside the Chamber of Commerce with Tom Donahue, AFL-CIO with Richard Trumka, in the first major hearing a year and a half ago, testified toward a nickel a year phased in to reach 20 cents increase in the gas and diesel. Would be $330 billion over 5 years. It would be not only paying what we owe, it would also be increasing the funding to the tune of about $15 billion a year to spend on congestion, addressing bottlenecks, and modernizing our current infrastructure. whether that's bridges, ports, whether it's, road maintenance, all of the above. So the FAST Act reauthorization I start with because that has to get done. And any of the other debates in the newspapers or on TV about the negotiations going on with Joe Biden on infrastructure are whistling past the graveyard, because this is the most important thing to nail down this year. It's an opportunity for Congress and the president to modernize that system, to update it, and in doing so, it will provide stability to all the people who depends on roads and bridges, to transit systems who get a set share, a sort of grand bargain of almost 20% of fees paid into the Highway Trust Fund. And it's that reauthorization is what we've been the most focused on. Contrast that with the one really important point about that reauthorization, it will have to be done bipartisan. And so at least in the Senate, it requires 60 votes to move it procedurally through the Senate. So it will have to have a majority, supermajority consensus to be able to move in the Senate. The president Congress could not just do this in the partisan tool that they want to use on some of the other things. So the second big discussion, and it's really taken over the discussion, is a Biden infrastructure proposal. He's proposed, I think it's the American Jobs Plan or something, but it's 2 point, and it depends on how you score it, but basically $2.5 trillion with a T dollars. And he has proposed $115 billion new dollars, so over and above what we're spending today, on roads and bridges, and some other things, a lot on transit. I think 60, 70 billion on transit, somewhere less than 100 billion, but close. 170 billion on electrification, that the federal government would sponsor, subsidize, seed money, whatever you want to call it. So some really transformative things, and also an opportunity for the congressional committees that would write such an infrastructure extra proposal, for them not to try to take money out of the Highway Trust Fund for roads to fund public transit, additional public transit. So it could be hopeful. Now, I will be the first to tell you that I'm a older than 50-year-old guy from Tennessee. A lot of what the Biden infrastructure proposal suggests or proposes sure doesn't sound like infrastructure to me. Out of $2.5 trillion dollars, you have somewhere around 5% of it for roads and bridges, a little bit for air infrastructure, for airports related. You have a little bit for water infrastructure, a little bit for rail, and then maybe you can get your way to broadband. But even with all of these, you're not talking about even $1 trillion. A lot of this is sort of social programming and saying human beings are infrastructure too. And while I don't personally share that approach, a lot of Democrats do. Key people to watch on which Democrats do will be the moderate senators. Joe Manchin is the most discussed. The two senators from Arizona, Kyrsten Sinema and Mark Kelly, and then also a few others like John Tester from Montana, Mark Warner from Virginia. But as the Democrats will have to get 50 Senate Democrats to agree to whatever this is. So I predict that we will not see a $2.5 trillion infrastructure proposal. But if we get the FAST Act reauthorization or the next highway bill, this money on top could be important, and we are not necessarily opposed to it, except I would say the way that President Biden has suggested this be paid for is with raising corporate taxes, period. Now, he's talking about raising a lot of other stuff to fund other programs, with capital gains, stepped up basis. I don't think the trucking industry cares a lot unless they're financial entities within companies related to trucking, but carried interest and some other things. So with all that said, it's a sort of catch-all of non-user fee funding to raise taxes. Oh, also personal income taxes. So this package of tax increases that Joe Biden's talking about, I can tell you right now, they are not all going to pass. There are a number that will not. Some will. I will guarantee you that taxes are going up. I'll talk about that a tiny bit more in a minute. But in the discussion about infrastructure and in trying our best to listen to and represent USA Trucks and the companies that depend on you and all of our other members, our primary simple goals on this are we want to make sure that Congress increases sustainable investment in our road and bridge infrastructure. And right now, the only way they can do that is through some user fees. And I can tell all of you, I think all of you know, the vehicle miles traveled fee, or tax is not ready. So we may wind up with a VMT user fee system, but we're not there yet. Shoring up the Highway Trust Fund, HTF is an acronym for that, is important. We care a ton about safety. And so there are some really cost-effective, data-driven, proven strategies on safety. Best simple example would be automated emergency braking mandates on that going forward. There was an effort on that last year. We supported, ATA policy supported on new equipment. I would expect that something comes to pass on AEB, but that clearly, at least in the trucking industry, is a very straightforward way for policymakers to address some of these. And there are some suggestions that we're pushing back on, like side underride guards. The data isn't there yet on side underride guards. There are some victim advocacy groups who have lost family members to passenger vehicles that have slid under trucks. So we're both pro and con, depending on what they are, but are working with Peter DeFazio, the key Democrat who runs the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and the safety title, which in the Senate is in the Commerce Committee, to make the best case and talk about what's cost effective and find ways that we can potentially support. Finally, and to me, the most exciting part of this, and not easiest, is workforce development. And you can't turn on the cable news right now without hearing about driver shortage, and that's because there is one. And the Teamsters in OIDA would tell you there's no driver shortage; it's a pay problem. And we know that companies like USA Trucks are increasing pay. We are seeing that across the industry. Bob Costello has great numbers, and because he has great numbers, that's why I'm number 3 on the list. I'm not the first guy people call in; I'm the last. But so workforce development, we have some really exciting new stuff. The work that James is doing with diversity is incredibly exciting. We had done a pilot in Baltimore to talk about urban hiring. A lot of young men and women don't see 18-wheelers very often, are not as familiar with the career that they could have. So that's pretty important. And we're really hoping that that something I'll tell you about in a minute is one of, if not, it's surely not a silver bullet, but one of the solutions. And I've talked enough. So the next slide.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
I wonder if I can interrupt you for a second. So I love that last point you made, and you're probably going to talk about this, but I was shocked actually to find out that 40% of inner city residents don't have a driver's license. And so I think you're going to address that here in a second. Just on the infrastructure front, I have kind of 2 questions, and you can dodge them if you want. One, you did a good job basically advocate as a funding mechanism for infrastructure right now, fuel tax. But with more and more EVs coming on the road, there's going to have to be a solution. You mentioned that the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, isn't ready yet, and I totally agree. So with those 2 things in mind, I have 2 kind of related questions. The first one is, can you just offer some brief insight about states with truck-only tolls and what we think about that and how that plays into what you discussed, because I think it's kind of the other side of those things.
Yeah.
And then the second one is, do you have any infrastructure thoughts that you'd like to add regarding autonomous vehicles or EVs?
So on the user fee piece of it and tolls, I mean, number one, we oppose tolls. We violently oppose truck-only tolls. We have a case going in Rhode Island right now where they've used a loophole in bridge, sort of a bridge provision, rebuilding bridges to start tolls, which if they were tolling everybody, they might be able to get away with. I suspect they would be able to get away with, but the fact that they discriminate against interstate commerce, basically with out-of-state, I'm going to use an unfair term here that's not appropriate here, but disparate impact, the additional impact that it hits interstate carriers or non-domestic carriers in the state of Rhode Island, is something we believe is unconstitutional and are suing. And and welcome anyone who wants to follow up with me about that. Please do. It's at this point looks like about a $2 million lawsuit, and we're raising money because we don't budget for such things. But I think the truck only tolls if Rhode Island gets away with this, and we do feel right now, confidence is a strong word, but we feel good about our chances in this case. But were Rhode Island to get away with this, we know of other states that are looking at it hard. Pennsylvania, Indiana, Wyoming, that are discussing hitting only trucks with tolls. And this is absurd. So I think we're going to see success on the legal front on it. I welcome anyone who wants to reach out to me and sees this as the threat that it is. And I can tell you that the trucking industries and the shippers who depend on it that are moving through the corridor of Rhode Island are seeing this added to shipping costs, period, and to prices on goods that are coming through. So this is going to be an economy-wide hit if it does get landed just on trucks. On electric vehicles, James is right that there are more of them. We see the F-150, Joe Biden going up to an electric F-150. Although interestingly enough, I heard that thing is 5 tons. So the trade-off in the sparkly new thing of electricity also means probably more road damage and more need for infrastructure funding. But right now, electric vehicles are 2% of vehicles on the road. Hybrids are, again, we're talking about low single digits. So I think our goal is to bridge the current world into the next world, and a 5-year highway bill gives us the time to do that. And we believe that the fuel tax is the way to bridge that. There's nothing better than the fuel tax. And if you fast forward to the likelihood of BMT, what you're going to see is somebody in Congress or at the IRS or at the White House has to decide how much people pay, right? Like VMT is, we're going to track how many miles you do. If we do it in the least privacy invading way, and let's assume that you do that with an odometer reading or something, you are talking about 270 million vehicles, including trucks, 270 million taxpayers. So that is a massive implementation, a massive compliance problem. So we'll see how they get around to it. But even before you get to the final implementation, you have to decide how much do trucks pay? How much does an F-150 pay? Do you do it because it's heavy, or do you incentivize that they put less emissions into the environment? Those are incredibly hard fought policy debates. So I see it as desperately in need of a bridge, and that's why we're not opposed to VMT. That'll be a hard policy fight, and that's what you have a trade association for. We like those kind of fights, but it's still a few years off. AV, James, I think that the sad truth in Washington is we are snarled up by, right now it's by trial lawyers and Teamsters on doing anything meaningful by Congress on automated vehicles. And the testing of vehicles, the operation of some of these automated vehicles are currently happening fairly smoothly from what our carriers tell us, and I welcome anybody else's thoughts, in the states. And so the states have found accommodations with rules and regulations, and probably legal liability in how they're able to operate. So right now, there is just not a lot of room. Washington is the least active place in terms of anything other than a fight between blood-sucking trial lawyers and Teamsters who believe that truckers are all going to lose their jobs, and we don't believe that automated vehicles are going to be fully automated right away. We really don't. So we see this as a long taper on whatever sort of impacts it will be on labor. And frankly, you find any trucking company, any fleet, and it's a hand over your heart, like the military and law enforcement and nurses and doctors, in terms of how we feel about drivers. So we've had technology to automate airplanes for 50 years, and any of you who've flown an airplane in the last day or month or year still sees 2 pilots up front, pilot and a co-pilot. So I think that we have plenty of time to work out the sort of civic agreement on what those may be, but Great question. Both those are great. And I wish I had a better answer on the AV, but I think we're sort of stuck in the mud. Talking about energy and environmental, we're also bullish on this, which is a pro-business group, might surprise some people who don't understand trucking as well, but we already have a lot of standards. We're a heavily regulated industry, and what's harder for us is this patchwork of rules in the states versus a definitive federal standard, and also the unrealistic goals that states will bake into their regulations. And CARB, the California Air Resources Board, is first among all states in this, I believe. But we've been having a lot of conversations with big fleets recently, begging for whatever kind of help on the EV standards that are electric vehicle requirements that are being pushed out in California, because there's not capacity. And these are fleets that could capitalize new fleets of electric trucks if they needed to, but the manufacturing capacity isn't there. Some of the rules about warranties and maintenance and compliance are not there. So some states are racing to be the greenest without thinking about how realistic these standards are. And we, along with our state federation leaders, are California Trucking Association or Nevada Trucking Association or whoever, are doing our best to present data to try to influence these states. But we really need the federal government to help make this more reasonable, and EPA typically is. These realistic timelines and implementations are vital. I mentioned the greenhouse gas phase 2. It was a 10-year window that we here, I will say this was right before I came to ATA, but our experts, one of whom was a former EPA attorney, worked with our OEMs, worked with our engine manufacturers, worked with trailer manufacturers to see what might be reasonable, and EPA was comfortable with it. So to achieve some of these, gas mileage, some of the standards that they set forth in it, they were achievable, and in a way that may not even cost the industry that much, as they ultimately get built into new equipment. So EPA is a place that we can discuss these and have fair and sort of federal guidelines and requirements for the regulatory process that permit or require data. Also, for Chris and us, a number of conversations with forward-thinking people like James, like other big and small companies, whether it's UPS or Mike Miller Trucking in Kansas, about trying to get and I think this is just Biden and a Democratic House and Senate waking some people up that the types of debates that have happened on the national and the state level are a vocabulary that we're not as familiar with. And I sound cheesy saying that, but just as an example, talking about carbon taxes, some of this has hit me multiple times with really sophisticated carriers talking about carbon taxes, and how we look at carbon taxes and how we spend, in places or in a country where carbon taxes or carbon limits could be realistic, how the money might be spent from those. If there is a market for carbon, and I don't say that's a good idea or bad idea, but if that's the trend, preparing to be ready to talk about how that impacts the industry is important. And look, the fuel tax is a carbon tax. If you're 80,000 pounds and getting 5 or 6 miles a gallon, you're paying a lot more than somebody with a 4-cylinder, Fiat. And the incentives and disincentives that are built into the market conditions of that are ones that we're comfortable with. So how can we use some of our historic knowledge on that to influence a policy debate that may not wind up with new laws today or tomorrow, but it may? And there are some senators, Republican senators, who are more comfortable with a market solution on carbon or other types of conversations that we have less of, equity in transportation. Environmental justice is a big focus for this EPA. There are going to be rules and regulations that they have regarding environmental justice, and it always gives me a bit of a shiver to get into conversations that are as partisan as that. But we at least need our members to be able to give us feedback on the impacts those have. One great example is I-81 in Syracuse. I'm assuming that USA trucks roll through I-81 in Syracuse. The state and the city have talked about, effectively blowing up I-81 through the city and rerouting it to reconnect historic neighborhoods, African American and other neighborhoods in Syracuse, and there are a lot of outcomes of this that are bad, very, very bad. Businesses downtown or businesses through this stretch. Even lack of equity. They're talking about having some exit that pipes a lot of traffic right off at high school, or Martin Luther King High School, predominantly African American. So having a voice in the debate is pretty important, and we hope to do that. And finally, I'd say the work in the states, and California is a big one, but not only. Our guy Glenn Kedzie, who's our Vice President of Environmental Policy, Environment and Energy, is constantly supporting work in states as we try to push through some of these really new and at least in terms of their prominence and the amount of work we have to spend on them, so that it's not just a national thing, it's a state thing. Next slide. Taxes, I've got something simple for you, and that's they're going up. This process called budget reconciliation is a straightforward one. Republicans have used it, Democrats have used it, and you get to use it basically once a year. If you pass a budget resolution, you can include the ability to use this tool. And budget reconciliation means all you have to get is 50 plus the vice president in the Senate. The House, you can pass whatever you want anyway, as long as you get enough of your party lining up for it. The Senate, you have to get a supermajority. You have to get 60 unless you have this tool. This tool is a pretty useful tool, but it is something that means the Democrats do not have to bring a single Republican along. So what they do have to bring along, back to Joe Manchin, is at least all the Democrats. So in the Senate, they have to bring all 50. So if they lose Joe Manchin, John Tester, Kirsten Sinema, and on, there are 5 to 7 Democrats depending on the issue. So taxes are going to go up. I would predict to you, and we discussed this in the panel discussion that James referenced, my Democrat friend. I would predict that that corporate taxes on business are going to go up. The C corporation, it's believed that they'll probably go up to 25. They're basically at 21 now. Joe Biden talked about taking it to 28. 25 sounds like what Joe Manchin could live with, just to be oversimple. Probably going to be some increase on those who are earning over 400,000 a year. David Cassignetti, his friend, the Democrat friend, guesses that they're probably going to be something higher than that, probably more like $1 million, but just personal income taxes on that. And for pass-through companies, that's not just personal income taxes, that's your business. So these are, they're going to go up, period. We have to tell our story on estate taxes, for family-owned companies where you don't have to sell all the assets, on capital gains taxes, stepped up basis, some of those other things. So we have an expert on this at ATA, and we do a great job of telling the trucking story and working in coalition with the United States Chamber, Business Roundtable, and the other trade association geeks in town. We're going to be talking about not only corporate and business taxes, but the user fee. I've talked about that a good bit, but on the back end of the user fee is, how do we get rid of the federal excise tax? It's a World War I tax. It's been around. Piece of good news, not crazy secret, but not widely known either. Peter DeFazio and a few members of the Ways and Means Committee, with whom Chris Spear is very close friends, they think it's ridiculous that there's a federal excise tax. So if they pass a change to taxes, either in the reauthorization of the highway bill or in reconciliation, there are a number of Democrats who want to do away with these taxes, to repeal them and refill the highway trust fund with user fees. So we are hopeful that this burden, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 per unit, for trucking companies, and that's a big round number, but it's really, if you're buying really expensive trailers like a tanker truck, it's a lot. If you're buying tractors, it's still a lot. So this is straight to the bottom line of being able to hire, making capital investments, et cetera. And then there are a lot of nits and nats tax incentives. Alt fuel is one that has never been made permanent, but whether it's biofuels, biodiesel, propane, number of those that are really important to the trucking industry. We want to take care of those. Also workforce development grants and possibilities. So we're paying attention. Perfect time. Labor policy, it is going to be nothing but headwinds. First thing I should tell you, I say almost nothing but headwinds. First thing I would tell you with the Biden administration is they have really effective people who know how to run the Department of Labor, and know how to do rulemakings, know what's legal and what isn't, and don't make mistakes. And so, when you have a very effective adversary, in this area, we're largely adversaries, but when you have a very effective adversary, you've got to be totally on your game. We're well staffed for that. Chris Spear was the number 3 at DOL. Nick Giel, who I've mentioned before, our Vice President of Labor and Workforce, was the Chief of Staff to Alex Acosta, former Labor Secretary, and also wrote many of these laws on the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. So we are engaging a lot, and many who came away from our mid-year meeting said, the panel that Nick did on what we can expect on labor made me sick at my stomach. I didn't realize it was as strong of a headwind as it is. It is, and we will need your help, and we will need to play, all pro ball on this one. Many of these are going to be regulatory tools. I do not believe that Congress is going to make significant changes. They rarely do. We saw them try to use reconciliation to increase the minimum wage, and they were not able to. It was not within the rules. The parliamentarian did not let them. So, I expect that most of the fight on this is going to be regulatory tools, and the liberal states with aggressive departments of labor, partnering with the DOL here in Washington, D.C. So it's going to be tough sledding, and we hope to tell our story well. We hope to slow them down. We hope to defeat them, but it will be playing defense. What are some of these issues? Independent contractor. Joe Biden's website in his campaign was, I want a federal AB5 standard. I want the California standard, which in my mind effectively criminalizes independent contractors. So phooey on that. We have an independent contractor ambassador program where independent contractor drivers go up and talk to members of Congress. We're doing 100 of those this year. A lot of people want to be independent contractors, and for Congress to say you're not free to is absurd. So we're going to make sure we tell that. OSHA standards. There are a lot of different labor standards that give causes for action. That also, one today was about the pandemic and what businesses may be required to do. They've been talking about an emergency temporary standard. I was hearing this morning from people way smarter than I am that they may move to a permanent rulemaking on this, which would be a tremendous potential threat to companies, at least in compliance and record keeping and enforcement actions. So we have to stay on our toes about that. A lot of this enforcement and compliance and leads to sort of this last bullet, the Service Contract Act. There are a lot of laws on the books that are very labor friendly that don't get enforced as aggressively as they could be. I think you're going to see more of that. So I want to talk one point before turn it back to folks, and just to, I have a handful of slides, but most of this is going to be sort of my stump speech, and that's to talk about younger drivers. One thing that the industry has tried to do for a long time is, how can we bring new talent in? How can we bring young men and women into trucking before they've gone off to take other careers? So in 49 states, and 50 have some version of under 21, but in 49 states in the District of Columbia, you can get a CDL. A man or woman can get a CDL at 18. Just straight up, you can get one. You don't have to do anything extra. You can get a CDL at 18, and you can drive intrastate, but you can't cross state lines. And so how can we get young men and women safely into the cab to work in interstate commerce? And the real goal, I will say absolutely sincerely, the real goal of members of Chris, of all of us getting together on this, is not that this is some magic bullet to suddenly bring a flood of younger drivers in and knock the driver shortage out immediately, which I'm not saying that'd be bad. I'm just saying this isn't that. Because what we have is, we have discussed and worked with coalition partners like the Food Distributors of America and a lot of shipping partners here at Trade Association in Washington about how we could put a program together that would answer that question. How can we safely bring 18 to 20-year-olds who currently can get a CDL? How could we provide a training, mentoring program that could bring them into interstate commerce? And why this matters more than anything is, as we've dug into the stats, Right now at private truck driving schools, the average age for someone coming in to get trained for a CDL is 35 years old. So a young man or woman, I grew up around a lot of people in Tennessee who did not want to go to college when they turned 18, but they wanted to work hard. They didn't want to just sit in their parents' basement playing video games or, sell drugs or, do things that were not productive. Most all of them wanted a job that they could support themselves, an independent adult, they're willing to work hard. But right now, an 18-year-old cannot have a meaningful career in trucking, cannot do anything other than sort of niche intrastate moves, but they can get a CDL. So how could we reach men and women in high school, sophomore, junior year of high school, to be able to not just go from Erie, Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, which is 420 miles, but to be able to go from Erie, Pennsylvania to Conneaut, Ohio, 35 miles. Or, I always say for me, I love this map, but I always say for me, from my office in Arlington, I can see Bethesda, Maryland. So 10 miles away is Bethesda, Maryland. An 18-year-old can't haul to Bethesda, but can drive back and forth to Bristol, Virginia, almost into Tennessee. How can we safely get them into it? And the sort of backspiel or the backstory to me is, if we can convince members of Congress to work with DOT to mandate a change to the regs and a way to do it safely, and something that gives members of Congress and policymakers comfort, like this Drive Safe Act that we're pushing for. If we could get young men and women who are 18 to 20 that have an experienced driver for 280 hours of training, and that's not cheap, right? Like that, again, for a company to be able to dedicate an experienced driver for 280 hours is a significant cost of training. But if we could reach younger people, these young men and women could start at the beginning of their work life. They might not want to be a welder or be a tradesman or be whatever, but it opens up trucking as a career where they can clear the first couple of years, 2, 3, 4 years, get a couple 100,000 miles, be making a paycheck. And after having a couple 100,000 safe miles, they begin to have a career in trucking where if they want to be able to have a family and be there for Little League games and be at home, they can choose to, and I'll pick, maybe work for Walmart or work for Pepsi or work for somebody local where they're home every night. And so that dues paying beginning of their career as they're a young adult is really important, because when I was 35, the big difference in my life from when I was 18 was that I had a wife and kids. And so being able to shut my life down and people who depended on me and be away from home for 10 days or 2 weeks was that much more disruptive to my life. So we really want to we want young men and women to be able to pick trucking as a career, to get exposed to it, and to see this as a career of first resort as opposed to last resort when we pull people in their 30s and 40s. And one of the things of having this older driver age, in my mind, is we are constantly attriting so many people that our demographic bubble is just insane. So when suddenly a number of drivers retire because of the pandemic, we don't have enough fuel haulers to be able to bridge the Colonial Pipeline hack. The fuel hauling really got clobbered as many sectors sort of were able to adapt and pick up different customers. And if they were doing retail, maybe now they're doing e-commerce or whatever. So, so for us, the real hope here is that younger people, that we're able to reach younger people as an industry, not just as an association, but as companies, as community colleges, to bring people in because they want to. And while we don't see this as a magic bullet, we see this as a vital thing, a vital change to the current policies and laws to help younger people choose and to see this demographic bubble shift over time as companies and their trainers figure out how to do it. So we're really bullish on the Drive Safe Act, and I think as there will need to be a lot of answers to driver shortage and how we maintain, how we retain people, but we're hopeful. So I will stop there. That's going to be the slides, James and Tim and Mark, and I will be glad for any questions.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Bill. I mean, you just covered a whole bunch of ground. Every time I hear you talk or get a chance to speak with you, I have kind of two distinct, I guess, feelings or observations. The first is obviously professional. Like, gosh, all this stuff that I tend to just compartmentalize and ignore is really important to my business. And so I need to pay attention to that. The second one is personal, which is, oh my goodness, I need to be more involved locally and in my state politics because it has an impact, not only on my industry and my job, but on my family and community. And I know that's like the most obvious of obvious things, but sometimes I don't connect those things. Mark, do we have any I have one more question. It's probably Bill's favorite question, but do you have any questions from the chat?
Double check. I don't see any.
So, Bill,
I talk people to death, James.
no, I don't think
No,
so.
We do have one.
So we do have
one
we have a
question,
couple
Mark.
here.
Did you see it?
We still have an issue of attracting drivers for long haul. What are some possible solutions ATA is advocating to help with that issue? So I'm assuming like maybe hours. Go ahead.
So there have been, it's interesting when, at different stages of the pandemic, we've had requests for, waivers and exemptions to the hours of service rules so that people could drive further. And we've had FMCSA for Donald Trump and, Joe Biden reach out to us about it. What I can say is for our members, and something in the neighborhood of 3/4 of our members are fewer than 20 trucks. So we are not, we have companies like James's or companies like FedEx. We have really big carriers. We have the bulk of ATA members are not big carriers. We did not have anybody asking for extensions to these hours of service. And I think partly because tri-lawyers, if you, God forbid, were to have somebody in a collision and damage or harm to others, I don't think tri-lawyers really care that you had an exemption from FMCSA. So, some of what we have heard has been sort of along the legal lines too. So the simple answer, Mark, is there are little changes that we have been working with our state associations, and we saw more of during the pandemic, about making it easier to ensure people can get their either med card extended, things about certification. And states are miserable about sharing that among each other. So some of these training standards, as we saw training schools just shut down, many of them, as they started to come up in some states, interestingly, California was one that worked with Arizona, which has been a pretty rare thing. But we've seen some states begin to transfer information to one another to make it easier to bring people through training schools and get certifications done. So, and in the background, we've had that, again, streamlining of these state-specific standards. Big carrier in Iowa who recruits a lot out of big cities in the South, wants to be able to train in centralized places, but it's not the driver's state of domicile. Some of these domicile issues about bringing people in and streamlining that and making it easier. So keeping people who are drivers now through some of the difficulties they have with certification and making it easier to bring them in. We're hoping that is a small part of the answer, but there's not a magic bullet.
A follow-up that came in on that, it's a great question, is what percentage of OTR drivers are women? Is there an aggressive push to appeal to this group to help solve the driver shortage?
That fantastic question. Chris and I were talking about this to the EPA administrator yesterday. It's somewhere in the neighborhood, and by OTR, whether this is just OTR, this includes LTL, there may be a number of different categories, so I won't perfectly capture OTR, but is somewhere in the neighborhood at high mid single digits, 6-7%. Now I know of a couple of companies that are at like 15, and that is cause for incredible celebration. And there are real challenges that we hear of women feeling comfortable being in truck stops, so for over the road, sleeper cab, sleeper berths, safety being something understandably different for females and for males. I will say though, on the Drive Safe Act, when we did this target program in Baltimore, I do think that if we can reach out to younger people and show younger women and men that the truck driving career of 2021 doesn't look like the truck driving career of 1965, that it's not all just big people throwing boxes on their shoulder and running around kind of like a rolling stevedore, that at the end of the day, we can bring more women in if we can get into high schools, show them what truck driving is, and help capture them at the beginning of their work life. And clearly family burdens fall, maybe it's different for you, but at my family, they fall more on my wife. And so, getting people integrated with their work life before they have a family, as many family obligations is key. So we really do think that younger driver is a vital component to increasing females. We also have women in trucking. We have a number of different initiatives to tell the story, to reach image and training schools, but it's slow. We got more to do.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Bill. I think on the agenda it says I'm going to have some closing comments. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I think we're about at the end of our time. It's great to have everybody on the call. We appreciate your interest in this and other topics. Certainly, if you have any further questions about USA Truck, USAT Capacity Solutions, or our other capabilities, reach out to your USAT Capacity Solutions salesperson, Tim, Mark, myself. Bill, as always, thank you for your time. I'm going to end in a little bit of an unusual way and ask you to answer one final question, and then we'll just end with your answer, which is, how are the midterm elections looking for both houses of Congress?
Yeah, that's off. What I would normally do if I weren't ending it was throw that back at you and see what you think before I answer. But I think that I think what we're seeing is the economy's coming back. People's lives are getting back to something that they enjoy more, and that the mood in the country is better with respect to their daily life. And so I think that as the economy gets better, it is going to be harder for President Biden and Democrats to pursue these really partisan solutions, and that those will stick to them. And when you have, I was talking about this yesterday, when you have people under the age of 35 who have never seen inflation in their lifetime, and a third of them are reporting that they are terrified of inflation, that's one of the biggest decisions that they're going to be facing. I don't want to be Nancy Pelosi, right? So, trying to put together what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jim Costa from California, moderate and the left. So I think it's hard for me to see a world in which Republicans don't take the House. I really think Republicans take the House, and I think the Senate is probably a toss-up leaning Republican. The Senate races, you have a number of Republican retirements, so I think it could go either way. There's some states that are what I would call Reagan Democrats, Ohio being a big one, with Rob Portman retiring. So we have some states that, North Carolina being another, that are, traditionally Republican states, but have that sort of strong sort of union, white or blue collar coalition that if Republicans screw it up, it always makes you marvel at the end of an election, like what people did wrong. But I think that the trends, and most importantly, and this is really silly, but a great place to sort of end is people in Washington, D.C. underappreciate and they overappreciate their own skills and their own, role in whatever just happened. And one thing is crazy true with few exceptions, and that is when a president wins, when you have a new president, the American people, God bless, because I feel this way too, even though I almost always vote Republican, the American people want divided government. They do not like seeing the greased skids of majority power on everything. And that is fundamental to the founding of this country and continues to be a part of it. And things move more slowly, and Americans do not want drastic changes today and tomorrow, whether it's on independent contractor laws, on taxes, or other things. And so I am betting that we have at least a Republican House. And I would right now guess that we have a Republican Senate, but just barely. And that it drives Joe Biden to a place that is, I think, constructive, because what I didn't get into here, because it would go on longer, I think Joe Biden's not a bad dude. I think he's pretty bipartisan. He historically is pretty bipartisan. You don't win the Democratic nomination for president by being bipartisan. You have to shout about how far left wing you are. But I worked most of my life in the Senate, and Joe Biden has been someone who has strongly held beliefs, but is willing to get to a consensus. And I think you're seeing that play out right now. So fingers crossed that we see divided government. But let me just say, James and the team at USA Trucks is among the best partnerships we have. And James, when he was pretty new, came in to meet with Chris and me and was saying, why does this matter? Like, why does government affairs matter? Or a version of that. And have just had a great time learning about your business, your customers, and you're stepping up in this role is something I appreciate. So Your people may not need to hear that, but you've been just fantastic to work with, and your whole team.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Bill. Great job. Thanks, you guys. Everybody have a great day and stay safe.